How to be rigorous. We've extracted 3 practical disciplines from the research for being rigorous rather than ruthless. Practical discipline number 1. When in doubt, don't hire. Keep looking. One of the immutable laws of management physics is Packard's law, so called because we first learned it in a previous research project from David Packard, co-founder of the Hewlett-Packard Company. It goes like this. No company can grow revenues consistently faster than its ability to get enough of the right people to implement that growth and still become a great company. If your growth rate in revenues consistently outpaces your growth rate in people, you simply will not, indeed you cannot, build a great company. Those who build great companies understand that the ultimate throttle on growth for any great company is not markets, it's not technology, it's not competition, it's not products. It is one thing above all others, the ability to get and keep enough of the right people. The management team at Circuit City during its transition era instinctively understood Packard's law. Driving around Santa Barbara the day after Christmas a number of years ago, I noticed something different about the Circuit City store. Other stores had signs and banners reaching out to customers, always the best prices, or great after-holiday deals, or best after-Christmas selection, and so forth. Then I looked over at the Circuit City store. It had a banner that read, "Always looking for great people." The sign reminded me of our interview with Walter Bruckert, vice president during the Good to Great years. When asked to name the top 5 factors that led to the transition from mediocrity to excellence, Bruckert said, and I quote, this is a direct quote, "1 would be people, 2 would be people, 3 would be people, 4 would be people, and 5 would be people. A huge part of our transition can be attributed to our discipline in picking the right people." Unquote. Bruckert then recalled a conversation with CEO Alan Wurtzel during a growth spurt at Circuit City. "Alan, I'm really wearing down trying to find the exact right person to fill this position or that position. At what point do I compromise?" Without hesitation, Alan said, "You don't compromise. We find another way to get through until we find the right people." One of the key contrasts between Alan Wurtzel at Circuit City and Sidney Cooper at Silo, which is the comparison company to Circuit City during the transition era, is that Wurtzel spent the bulk of his time in the early years focused on getting the right people on the bus, whereas Cooper spent 80% of his time focusing on the right stores to buy. Wurtzel's first goal was to build the best, most professional management team in the industry. Cooper's first goal was simply to grow as fast as possible. Circuit City put tremendous emphasis on getting the right people all up and down the line, from delivery drivers to vice presidents. Silo, in contrast, developed a reputation for not being able to do the basics, like making home deliveries without damaging the products. According to Circuit City's Dan Rexinger, we made the best home delivery drivers in the industry. We told them, "You are the last contact the customer has with Circuit City. We're going to supply you with uniforms. We will require that you shave, that you don't have body odor. You're going to be professional people." The change in the way we handled customers and making a delivery was absolutely incredible. We would get thank you notes back on how courteous the drivers were. 5 years into Wurtzel's tenure, Circuit City and Silo had essentially the same business strategy, the same what? Yet Circuit City took off like a rocket, beating the general stock market 18.5 to 1 in the 15 years after its transition, while Silo, which had the same strategy, keep in mind, same what, bumped along until it was finally acquired by a foreign company. Same strategy, different people, different results. Practical discipline number 2. When you know you need to make a people change, act. The moment you feel the need to tightly manage someone, you've likely made a hiring mistake. The best people don't need to be managed. Let me repeat that. That's one of the key points of this whole book. The best people, the right people on the bus, don't need to be managed, don't need to be disciplined, don't need to be motivated. Guided, taught, led, yes, but not tightly managed. We've all experienced or observed the following scenario. We have a wrong person on the bus, and we know it. Yet we wait, we delay, we try alternatives. We give a third and fourth chance. We hope that the situation will improve. We invest time in trying to properly manage the person. We build little systems to compensate for his or her shortcomings, and so forth. But the situation doesn't improve. When we go home, we find our energy diverted by thinking or talking with our spouses about that person. Worse, all the time and energy we spend on that one person siphons energy away from developing and working with all the right people. We continue to stumble along until the person leaves on his own, to our great sense of relief, or we finally act, also to our great sense of relief. Meanwhile, our best people wonder. They're looking at us thinking, "What took you so long?" Letting the wrong people hang around is unfair to all the right people, as they inevitably find themselves compensating for the inadequacies of the wrong people. Worse, it can drive away the best people. Strong performers are intrinsically motivated by performance, and when they see their efforts impeded by carrying extra weight, they eventually become frustrated. Waiting too long before acting is equally unfair to the people who need to get off the bus. For every minute you allow a person to continue holding a seat when you know that person will not make it in the end, you are stealing in the worst way. You are stealing a portion of that person's life. Time that he or she could spend finding a better place where he could flourish. Indeed, if we're honest with ourselves, the reason we wait too long often has less to do with concern for that person and more to do with our own convenience. He's doing an okay job and it would be a huge hassle to replace him, so we avoid the issue. Or we find the whole process of dealing with the issue to be stressful and distasteful. So, to save ourselves stress and discomfort, we wait. And wait. And wait. Meanwhile, all the best people are still wondering, when are they going to do something about this? How long is this going to go on? Using data from Moody's Company Information Reports, we were able to examine the pattern of turnover in the top management levels. We found no difference in the amount of turnover within a period of time, between the good to great and comparison companies. But we did find differences in the pattern of churn. The good to great companies showed the following bipolar pattern at the top management level. People either stayed on the bus for a long time or got off the bus in a hurry. In other words, the good to great companies did not churn more, they churned better. The good to great leaders did not pursue an expedient try a lot of people and keep who works model of management. Instead, they adopted the following approach. Let's take the time to make rigorous A+ selections right up front. If we get it right, we'll do everything we can to try to keep them on board for a long time. If we make a mistake, and all of them made mistakes, then we will confront that fact so that we can get on with our work and they can get on with their lives. I need to underscore a key point here. The good to great leaders would not rush to judgment. Often they invested substantial effort in determining whether they had someone in the wrong seat before concluding that they had the wrong person on the bus entirely. This is a key premise or a key principle in this chapter. If you think you might have a bus problem, ask first, perhaps I have a seat problem. When Coleman Mockler became CEO of Gillette, he didn't go on a rampage, wantonly throwing people out the windows of a moving bus. He spent fully 55% of his time during his first 2 years in office jiggering around with the management team, changing or moving 38 of the top 50 people. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. 38 of the top 50 people he moved around to get it right. Said Mockler, every minute devoted to putting the proper person in the proper slot is worth weeks of time later. Similarly, Alan Wurtzel of Circuit City sent us a letter after reading an early draft of this chapter, wherein he commented, and this is Wurtzel, "Your point about getting the right people on the bus as compared to other companies is dead on. There is one corollary that is also important. I spent a lot of time thinking and talking about who sits where on the bus. I called it putting square pegs in square holes and round pegs in round holes. Instead of firing honest and able people who are not performing well, it is important to try to move them once or even 2 or 3 times to other positions where they might blossom." It might take time to know for certain if someone is simply in the wrong seat or whether he needs to get off the bus altogether. Nonetheless, when the good to great leaders knew they had to make a people change, they would act. But how do you know when you know? 2 key questions can help. First, if it were a hiring decision rather than a should this person get off the bus decision, if you were hiring this person all over again from scratch, would you hire? Second, if the person came to tell you that he or she is leaving to pursue an exciting new opportunity, would you feel terribly disappointed or secretly relieved? Practical discipline number 3. Put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. In the early 1960s, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris derived the vast majority of their revenues from the domestic arena. R.J. Reynolds' approach to international business was, if somebody out there in the world wants a camel, let them call us. Joe Cullman at Philip Morris had a different view. He identified international markets as the single best opportunity for long-term growth, despite the fact that the company derived less than 1% of its revenues from overseas. Cullman puzzled over the best strategy for developing international operations, and he eventually came up with a brilliant answer. It wasn't a what answer. Following the principle of first who, it was a who answer. He took his number 1 executive, George Weissman, off the primary domestic business and put him in charge of international. I mean, think about this. There's only 1% of the business at the time. International amounted to almost nothing, a tiny export department, a struggling investment in Venezuela and another in Australia, and a tiny operation in Canada. That's it. When Joe put George in charge of international, a lot of people wondered what George had done wrong, quipped one of Weissman's colleagues. Said Weissman himself, I didn't know whether I was being thrown sideways, downstairs, or out the window. Here I was running 99% of the business, and the next day I'd be running 1% or less. Yet, as Forbes magazine observed 20 years later, Cullman's decision to move Weissman to the smallest part of the business was a stroke of genius. Urbane and sophisticated, Weissman was the perfect person to develop markets like Europe, and he built international into the largest and fastest growing part of the company. In fact, under Weissman's stewardship, Marlboro became the best-selling cigarette in the world 3 years before it became number 1 in the United States. The RJR versus Philip Morris case illustrates a common pattern. The good to great companies made a habit of putting their best people on their best opportunities, not their biggest problems. The comparison companies had a penchant for doing just the opposite, failing to grasp the fact that managing your problems can only make you good, whereas building on your opportunities is the only way to become great. There's an important corollary to this discipline. When you decide to sell off your problems, Don't sell off your best people. This is one of those little secrets of change. If you create a place where the best people always have a seat on the bus, they're more likely to support changes in direction. When Kimberly-Clark sold the mills, Darwin Smith made it clear. The company might be getting rid of the paper business, but it would keep its best people. Many of our people had come up through the paper business. Then all of a sudden, the crown jewels were being sold off, and they're asking, "What's my future?" explained Dick Octor. And Darwin would say, "We need all the talented managers we can get. We keep them." Despite the fact that they had little or no consumer experience, Smith moved all the best people from paper to the consumer business. We interviewed Dick Appert, a senior executive who spent the majority of his career in the paper-making division at Kimberly-Clark. The same division sold off to create funds for the company's big move into consumer products. He talked with pride and excitement about the transformation of Kimberly-Clark and how it had the guts to sell the paper mills and how it had the foresight to exit the paper business and throw the proceeds into the consumer business and how it had taken on Procter & Gamble and won. "I never had any argument with our decision to dissolve the paper division of the company," he said. "We did get rid of the paper mills at that time, and I was absolutely in agreement with that." Stop and think about that for a moment. The right people want to be part of building something great. And Dick Appert saw that Kimberly-Clark could become great by selling the part of the company where he had spent most of his working life. The Philip Morris and Kimberly-Clark cases illustrate a final point about the right people. We noticed a level 5 atmosphere, a level 5 team culture at the top executive level of every good to great company during the key transition years. Not that every executive on the team became a fully evolved level 5 leader to the same degree as Darwin Smith or Coleman Mockler, but each core member of the team transformed personal ambition into ambition for the company and for the team. This suggests that the team members had level 5 potential, or at least they were capable of operating in a manner consistent with the level 5 leadership style. You might be wondering, what's the difference between a level 5 executive team member and just being a good soldier? The difference is this. A level 5 executive team member does not blindly acquiesce to authority and is a strong leader in her own right. So driven and talented that she builds her arena into one of the very best in the world. Yet, at the same time, each team member must also have the ability to meld that individual strength into doing whatever it takes to make the company great. One of the crucial elements in taking a company from good to great is somewhat paradoxical. You need executives on the one hand who argue and debate, sometimes violently, eyeball to eyeball, like those Wells Fargo executives, in pursuit of the best answers. Yet, on the other hand, who will unify fully behind a decision, regardless of their personal or parochial interests. An article on Philip Morris said of the Coleman era, "These guys never agreed on anything, and they would argue about everything. And they would kill each other and involve everyone, high and low, talented people. But when they had to make a decision, the decision would emerge. This made Philip Morris. No matter how much they argued," said a Philip Morris executive, "they were always in search of the best answer. In the end, everybody stood behind the decision. All of the debates were for the common good of the company, not your own interests." First two, great companies and a great life. Whenever I teach the Good to Great findings, someone almost always raises the issue of personal cost in making a transformation. In other words, is it possible to build a great company and also build a great life? Or do you have to choose? The answer is yes. You can have both. The secret to doing so lies right here in this chapter. I spent a few short days with a senior Gillette executive and his wife at an executive conference in Hong Kong. During the course of our conversations, I asked them if they thought Coleman Mockler, the CEO most responsible for Gillette's transition from good to great, had had a great life. Coleman's life revolved around three great loves, they told me: his family, Harvard, and Gillette. Even during the darkest and most intense times of the takeover crises of the 1980s, and despite the increasingly global nature of Gillette's business, Mockler maintained remarkable balance in his life. He did not significantly reduce the amount of time he spent with his family, rarely working on evenings or weekends. He maintained his disciplined worship practices. He continued his active work on the governing board of Harvard College. When I asked how Mockler accomplished all of this, the executive said, "Oh, it really wasn't that hard for him. He was so good at assembling the right people around him and putting the right people in the right seats that he just didn't need to be there all hours of the day and night." That was Coleman's whole secret to success and balance. The executive went on to explain that he was just as likely to meet Mockler in the hardware store as the office. He really enjoyed puttering around the house, fixing things up. He always seemed to find time to relax that way. Then the executive's wife added, "When Coleman died, and we all went to the funeral, I looked around and realized how much love was in the room. This was a man who spent nearly all his waking hours with people who loved him, who loved what they were doing, and who loved one another, at work, at home, in his charitable work, wherever." The statement rang a bell for me, as there was something about the good to great executive teams that I couldn't quite describe, but that clearly set them apart. In wrapping up our interview with George Weissman of Philip Morris, I commented, "When you talk about your time at the company, it's as if you're describing a love affair." He chuckled and said, "Yes, other than my marriage, it was the passionate love affair of my life." I don't think many people would understand what I'm talking about, but I suspect my colleagues would. Weissman and many of his executive colleagues kept offices at Philip Morris, coming in on a regular basis long after retirement. A corridor at the Philip Morris World Headquarters is called the Hall of the Wizards That Was. It's the corridor where Weissman, Coleman, Maxwell, and others continue to come into the office, in large part because they simply enjoy spending time together. Similarly, Dick Appert of Kimberly-Clark said in his interview, "I never had anyone in Kimberly-Clark in all my 41 years say anything unkind to me. I thank God the day I was hired, because I've been associated with wonderful people, good people who respected and admired one another." Members of the good to great teams tended to become and remain friends for life. In many cases, they are still in close contact with each other years or decades after working together. It was striking to hear them talk about the transition era, for no matter how dark the days or how big the tasks, these people had fun. They enjoyed each other's company and actually looked forward to meetings. Imagine that. They looked forward to meetings. A number of the executives characterized their years on the good to great teams as the high point of their lives. Their experiences went beyond just mutual respect, which they certainly had, to lasting comradeship. Adherence to the idea of first who might be the closest link between a great company and a great life. For no matter what we achieve, if we don't spend the vast majority of our time with people we love and respect, we cannot possibly have a great life. But if we spend the vast majority of our time with people we love and respect, people we really enjoy being on the bus with, and who will never disappoint us, then we will almost certainly have a great life, no matter where the bus goes. The people we interviewed from the good to great companies clearly loved what they did, largely because they loved who they did it with. Summary points. First who, then what? The good to great leaders began the transformation by first getting the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus, and then they figured out where to drive it. The key point of this chapter is not just the idea of getting the right people on the team. The key point is that who questions come before what decisions, before vision, before strategy, before organization structure, before tactics. First who, then what, as a rigorous discipline consistently applied. The comparison companies frequently followed what we came to call the genius with 1,000 helpers model. A genius leader who sets a vision and then enlists a crew of highly capable helpers to make the vision happen. This model fails when the genius departs. The good to great leaders were rigorous, not ruthless, in people decisions. They did not rely on layoffs and restructuring as a primary strategy for improving performance. The comparison companies used layoffs to a much greater extent. We uncovered 3 practical disciplines for being rigorous in people decisions. Discipline number 1, when in doubt, don't hire, keep looking. Corollary to discipline 1, a company should limit its growth based on its ability to attract enough of the right people. Discipline number 2, when you know you need to make a people change, act. Corollary to discipline number 2, first, be sure you don't simply have someone in the wrong seat. And discipline number 3, put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. Corollary to discipline number 3, if you sell off your problems, don't sell off your best people. Good to great management teams consist of people who debate vigorously in search of the best answers, yet who unify behind decisions regardless of their personal parochial interests. And of course, we had some unexpected findings. First, we found no systematic pattern linking executive compensation to the shift from good to great. The purpose of compensation, we concluded, is not to motivate the right behaviors from the wrong people, but to get and keep the right people in the first place. The old adage, people are your most important asset, is wrong. People are not your most important asset. The right people are. And finally, whether someone is the right person has more to do with character traits and innate capabilities than with specific knowledge, background, or skills. It all adds up to an orientation, an obsession, a lens, a frame of reference for everything you do from this point forward. First who, then what? First who, then what? Chapter 4. Confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. There is no worse mistake in public leadership than to hold out false hopes soon to be swept away. Winston Churchill, The Hinge of Fate. In the early 1950s, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, commonly known as A&P, stood as the largest retailing organization in the world, and one of the largest corporations in the United States, at one point ranking behind only General Motors in annual sales. Kroger, in contrast, stood as an unspectacular grocery chain, less than half the size of A&P, with performance that barely kept pace with the general market. Then in the 1960s, A&P began to falter, while Kroger began to lay the foundations for a transition into a great company. From 1959 to 1973, both companies lagged behind the market, with Kroger pulling just a bit ahead of A&P. After that, the two companies completely diverged. And over the next 25 years, Kroger generated cumulative returns 10 times the market and 80 times better than A&P. How on earth did such a dramatic reversal of fortunes happen? How could a company as great as A&P, the number 2 largest company in the United States, the largest retailing company in the world, become so awful? A&P had a perfect model for the first half of the 20th century, when 2 world wars and a depression imposed frugality upon Americans. Cheap, plentiful groceries sold in utilitarian stores. But in the affluent second half of the 20th century, Americans changed. They wanted nicer stores, bigger stores, more choices in stores. They wanted fresh baked bread, flowers, health foods, cold medicines, fresh produce, 45 choices of cereal, and 10 types of milk. They wanted offbeat items like 5 different types of expensive sprouts and various concoctions of protein powders and Chinese healing herbs. Oh, and they wanted to be able to do their banking and get their annual flu shots while shopping. In short, they no longer wanted grocery stores. They wanted superstores with a big block S on the chest, offering almost everything under one roof, with lots of parking, cheap prices, clean floors, and a gazillion checkout lines. Right off the bat, you might be thinking, okay, so the story of A&P is one of an aging company that had a strategy that was right for the times. And then the times changed, and the world passed it by as younger, better-attuned companies gave customers more of what they wanted. What's so interesting about that? Same old story. Here's what's interesting. Both Kroger and A&P were old companies. Kroger at 82 years, A&P at 111 years, heading into the 1970s. Both Kroger and A&P had nearly all their assets invested in traditional grocery stores. Both companies had strongholds outside the major growth areas of the United States. And both companies had knowledge of how the world around them was changing. Yet, one of these 2 companies confronted the brutal facts of reality head on and completely changed its entire system in response. The other stuck its head in the sand. In 1958, Forbes magazine described A&P as the Hermit Kingdom, run as an absolute monarchy by an aging prince. Ralph Burger, the successor to the Hartford brothers, who had built the A&P dynasty, sought to preserve 2 things above all else: cash dividends for the family foundation and the past glory of the Hartford brothers. According to one A&P director, Burger considered himself the reincarnation of old John Hartford, even to the point of wearing a flower in his lapel every day from Hartford's greenhouse. He tried to carry out, against all opposition, what he thought Mr. John, that is Mr. John Hartford, would have liked. Burger instilled a "what would Mr. Hartford do" approach to decisions, living by the motto, "You can't argue with 100 years of success." Indeed, through Burger, Mr. Hartford continued to be the dominant force on the board for nearly 20 years. Never mind the fact that he was already dead. As the brutal facts about the mismatch between its past model and the changing world began to pile up, A&P mounted an increasingly spirited defense against those facts. In one series of events, the company opened a new store called The Golden Key, a separate brand wherein it could experiment with new methods and models to learn what customers wanted. It sold no A&P branded products. It gave the store manager more freedom. It experimented with innovative new departments, and it began to evolve toward what would become the modern superstore. Customers really liked it. Here, right under their noses, they began to discover the answer to the question of why they were losing market share and what they could do about it. They had the solution in the palm of their own hands. And what did A&P executives do with the Golden Key? They didn't like the answers it gave, so they closed it. A&P then began a pattern of lurching from one strategy to another, always looking for a single-stroke solution to its problems. It held pep rallies, launched programs, grabbed fads, fired CEOs, hired CEOs, and fired them yet again. It launched what one industry observer called a scorched earth policy, a radical price-cutting strategy to build market share, but never dealt with the basic fact that customers wanted not lower prices, but different stores. The price cutting led to cost cutting, which led to even drabber stores and poorer service, which in turn drove customers away, further driving down margins, resulting in even dirtier stores and worse service. After a while, the crud kept mounting, said one former A&P manager. We not only had dirt, we had dirty dirt. Meanwhile, over at Kroger, a completely different pattern arose. Kroger also conducted experiments in the 1960s to test the superstore concept. By 1970, the Kroger executive team came to an inescapable conclusion. The old model grocery store, which accounted for nearly 100% of Kroger's business, was going to become extinct. Unlike A&P, however, Kroger confronted this brutal truth and acted on it. The rise of Kroger is remarkably simple and straightforward, almost maddeningly so. During their interviews, Lyle Everingham and his predecessor Jim Herring, they were the CEOs during the pivotal transition years, were polite and helpful, but a bit exasperated by our questions. To them, it just seemed so clear. When we asked Everingham to allocate 100 points across the top 5 factors in the transition, he said, I find your question a bit perplexing. Basically, we did extensive research, and the data came back loud and clear. It's that simple. The super combination stores were the way of the future. We also learned that you had to be number 1 or number 2 in each market, or you had to exit. Sure, there was some skepticism at first, but once we looked at the facts, there was really no question about what we had to do. So we just did it. Kroger decided to eliminate, change, or replace every single store and depart every region that did not fit the new realities. The whole system would be turned inside out, store by store, block by block, city by city, state by state. By the early 1990s, Kroger had rebuilt its entire system on the new model and was well on the way to becoming the number 1 grocery chain in America, a position it would attain in 1999. Meanwhile, A&P still had over half its stores in the old 1950 size and had dwindled to a sad remnant of a once great American institution. Facts are better than dreams. One of the dominant themes from our research is that breakthrough results come about by a series of good decisions, diligently executed and accumulated one on top of another. Of course, the good to great companies did not have a perfect track record, but on the whole, they made many more good decisions than bad ones, and they made many more good decisions than the comparison companies. More important, on the really big choices, such as Kroger's decision to throw all its resources into the task of converting its entire system to the superstore concept, they were remarkably on target. This, of course, begs a question. Are we merely studying a set of companies that just happened by luck to stumble into the right set of decisions? Or was there something distinctive about their process that dramatically increased the likelihood of being right? The answer, it turns out, is that there was something quite distinctive about their process. Even though they saw themselves as lucky, they were not just lucky. The good to great companies displayed 2 distinctive forms of disciplined thought. Now, let me just pause here for a moment and remind us of the framework that we laid out at the beginning of this audiobook. A good to great transformation proceeds in a process of build-up leading to breakthrough. And that build-up to breakthrough process breaks into a few basic stages. In particular, stage 1, disciplined people. Stage 2, disciplined thought. Stage 3, disciplined action. Disciplined people who engage in disciplined thought, who take disciplined action. The previous 2 chapters, Level 5 Leadership and First 2, were about disciplined people. The next 2 chapters, the one we're in now and the Hedgehog, are all about disciplined thought. That's where we are in the framework. The first key method of disciplined thought, and the topic of this chapter, is that the good to great companies infuse the entire process with the brutal facts of reality. The second, which we will discuss in the next chapter, is that they developed a simple yet deeply insightful frame of reference for all decisions. When, as in the Kroger case, you start with an honest and diligent effort to determine the truth of the situation, the right decisions often become self-evident. Not always, of course, but often. And even if all the decisions do not become self-evident, one thing is certain. You absolutely cannot make a series of good decisions without first confronting the brutal facts. The good to great companies operated in accordance with this principle, and the comparison companies generally did not. Consider Pitney Bowes versus Addressograph during the transition of the 1970s. It would be hard to find 2 companies in more similar positions at a specific moment in history that then diverged so dramatically. Until 1973, Pitney Bowes and Addressograph had similar revenues, profits, numbers of employees, and stock charts. Both companies held near monopoly market positions with virtually the same customer base. Pitney Bowes in postage meters and Addressograph in address duplicating machines. And both faced the imminent reality of losing their monopolies. By year 2000, however, Pitney Bowes had grown to over 30,000 employees and had revenues in excess of $4 billion, compared to the sorry remnants of Addressograph, which had less than $100 million in revenues and only 670 employees. For the shareholder, Pitney Bowes outperformed Addressograph 3,581 to 1. Yes, 3,581 times better. So here we have a classic match pair. We have 2 companies in 1973 that are virtually identical. They're in the same kind of situation with the same size and revenues and opportunities and challenges that they face, and yet nearly 30 years later they are in completely different places. How on earth did this happen? Match pair, contrast, what do we learn? In 1976, a charismatic leader named Roy Ashe became CEO of Addressograph. A self-described conglomerateur, Ashe had previously built Litton by stacking acquisitions together that had since faltered. According to Fortune magazine, he sought to use Addressograph as a platform to re-establish his leadership prowess in the eyes of the world. Ashe set forth a vision to dominate the likes of IBM, Xerox, and Kodak in the emerging field of office automation. A bold plan for a company that had previously only dominated the envelope address duplication business. There's nothing wrong with a bold vision. But Ashe became so wedded to his quixotic quest that, according to Businessweek, he refused to confront the mounting evidence that his plan was doomed to fail and might take down the rest of the company with it. He insisted on milking cash from profitable arenas, eroding the core business while throwing money after a gambit that had little chance of success. Later, after Ashe was thrown out of office and the company had filed for bankruptcy, from which it did later emerge, he still refused to confront reality, saying, "We lost some battles, but we were winning the war." But Addressograph was not even close to winning the war, and people throughout the company knew it at the time. Yet the truth went unheard until it was too late. In fact, many of Adressagraph's key people bailed out of the company, dispirited by their inability to get top management to deal with the facts. Perhaps we should give Mr. Ash some credit for being a visionary who tried to push his company to greater heights. And to be fair, the Adressagraph board fired Ash before he had a chance to fully carry out his plans. But the evidence from a slew of respectable articles written at the time suggests that Ash turned a blind eye to any reality inconsistent with his own vision of the world. There is nothing wrong with pursuing a vision for greatness. Indeed, that is what this book is about, pursuing a vision of greatness. After all, the good to great companies also set out to create greatness. But unlike the comparison companies, the good to great companies continually refined the path to greatness with the brutal facts of reality. When you turn over rocks and look at all the squiggly things underneath, you can either put the rock down or you can say, my job is to turn over rocks and look at the squiggly things, even if what you see can scare the hell out of you. That quote from Pitney Bowes executive Fred Perdue could have come from any of the Pitney Bowes executives we interviewed. They all seemed a bit, well, to be blunt, neurotic and compulsive about Pitney's position in the world. This is a culture that is very hostile to complacency, said one executive. We have an itch that what we just accomplished, no matter how great, is never going to be good enough to sustain us, said another. During the key transition years, Pitney's first management meeting of each new year typically consisted of about 15 minutes discussing the previous year, which were almost always superb results, and then 2 hours talking about the scary, squiggly things that might impede future results. Pitney sales meetings were quite different from the "aren't we great" rah-rah sales conferences typical at most companies. The entire management team would lay itself open to searing questions and challenges from salespeople who dealt directly with customers. The company created a long-standing tradition of forums where people could stand up and tell senior executives what the company was doing wrong, shoving rocks with squiggly things in their faces and saying, "Look, you'd better pay attention to this." The Adressagraph case, especially in contrast to Pitney Bowes, illustrates a vital point. Strong, charismatic leaders like Roy Ash can all too easily become the de facto reality driving a company. Throughout the study, we found comparison companies where the top leader, comparison companies, these are the ones that didn't become great, where the top leader led with such force or instilled such fear that people worried more about what the leader would say, what the leader would think, what the leader would do, than they worried about external reality and what it could do to the company. Recall the climate at Bank of America, described in the previous chapter, wherein managers would not even make a comment until they knew how the CEO felt. We did not find this pattern at companies like Wells Fargo and Pitney Bowes, particularly during their best transition years, where people were much more worried about the scary, squiggly things than about the feelings of top management. The moment a leader allows himself to become the primary reality people worry about, rather than reality being the primary reality people worry about, you have a recipe for mediocrity, or worse. This is one of the key reasons why less charismatic leaders often produce better long-term results than their more charismatic counterparts. For those of you who are afflicted with a strong, charismatic personality, it's worthwhile to consider the idea that your charisma can be as much a liability as an asset. Your strength of personality can sow the seeds of problems when people filter the brutal facts from you. You can overcome the liabilities of charisma. You can transcend this particular affliction. But it does require conscious attention. Winston Churchill understood the liabilities of his strong personality, and he compensated for them beautifully during the Second World War. Churchill, as you know, maintained a bold and unwavering vision that Britain would not just survive, but would prevail as a great nation, despite the whole world wondering not if, but when, Britain would sue for peace. During the darkest days with nearly all of Europe and North Africa under Nazi control, the United States hoping to stay out of the conflict and Hitler fighting a one-front war he had not yet turned on Russia, Churchill said, "We are resolved to destroy Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. From this, nothing will turn us. Nothing. We will never parley. We will never negotiate with Hitler or any of his gang. We shall fight him by land. We shall fight him by sea. We shall fight him in the air until, with God's help, we have rid the earth of his shadow." Yet despite this bold vision, Churchill never failed to confront the most brutal facts. He feared that his towering charismatic personality might deter bad news from reaching him in its starkest form. So early in the war, he created an entirely separate department outside the normal chain of command, called the Statistical Office, with the principal function of feeding him continuously updated and completely unfiltered the most brutal facts of reality. He relied heavily on this special unit throughout the war, repeatedly asking for facts, just the facts. As the Nazi panzers swept across Europe, Churchill went to bed and slept soundly. "I had no need for cheering dreams," he wrote. "Facts are better than dreams." Now you might be wondering, how do you motivate people with brutal facts? Doesn't motivation flow chiefly from a compelling vision? The answer, surprisingly, is no. Not because vision is unimportant, but because expending energy trying to motivate people is largely a waste of time. One of the dominant themes that runs throughout this book is that if you successfully implement its findings, you will not need to spend time and energy motivating people. If you have the right people on the bus, they will be self-motivated. The real question then becomes, how do you manage in such a way as to not demotivate already motivated people? And one of the single most demotivating actions you can take is to hold out false hopes, soon to be swept away by events. Yes, leadership is about vision, but leadership is equally about creating a climate where the truth is heard and the brutal facts confronted. There's a huge difference between the opportunity to have your say and the opportunity to be heard. The good to great leaders understood this distinction, creating a culture wherein people had a tremendous opportunity to be heard and ultimately for the truth to be heard. How do you create a climate where the truth is heard? We offer 4 basic practices that we derived from the research. Practice number 1. Lead with questions, not answers. In 1973, 1 year after he assumed CEO responsibility from his father, Alan Wurtzel's company stood at the brink of bankruptcy, dangerously close to violation of its loan agreements. At the time, the company, then named Ward's, not to be confused with Montgomery Ward, was a hodgepodge of appliance and hi-fi stores with no unifying concept. Over the next 10 years, Wurtzel and his team not only turned the company around, but also created the Circuit City concept and laid the foundations for a stunning record of results, beating the market 22 times from its transition date in 1982 to January 1, 2000. When Alan Wurtzel started the long traverse from near bankruptcy to these stellar results, he began with a remarkable answer to the question of where to take the company. His answer? Alan, where are we going to take the company? What's your vision? What's your direction? What's your strategy? I don't know. It's such a wonderful answer because it's so honest. Unlike leaders such as Roy Ash of Addressograph, Wurtzel resisted the urge to walk in with the answer. Instead, once he put the right people on the bus, he began not with answers, but with questions. Alan was a real spark, said a board member. He had an ability to ask questions that were just marvelous. We had some wonderful debates in the boardroom. It was never just a dog and pony show where you would just listen and then go to lunch. Indeed, Wurtzel stands as one of the few CEOs in a large corporation who put more questions to his board members than they put to him. He took the same approach with his executive team, constantly pushing and probing and prodding with questions. Each step along the way, Wurtzel would keep asking questions until he had a clear picture of reality and its implications. They used to call me the prosecutor because I would home in on a question, said Wurtzel. Like a bulldog. I wouldn't let go until I understood. Why? 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 Like Wurtzel, leaders in each of the good to great transitions operated with a somewhat Socratic style. Furthermore, they used questions for one and only one reason: to gain understanding. They didn't use questions as a form of manipulation. Don't you agree with me on that? Or as a way to blame or put down others. Why did you mess that up? When we asked the executives about their management team meetings during the transition era, they said they spent much of the time just trying to understand. The good to great leaders made particularly good use of informal meetings, where they meet with groups of managers and employees with no script, agenda, or set of action items to discuss. Instead, they would start with questions like, "So what's on your mind? Can you tell me about that? Can you help me understand? What should we be worried about?" These non-agenda meetings became a forum where current realities tended to bubble to the surface. Leading from good to great does not mean coming up with the answers. And it does not mean motivating everyone to follow your messianic vision. It means having the humility, level 5 humility, to grasp the fact that you do not yet understand enough to have all the answers. And then to ask the questions that will lead to the best possible insights. Number 2, engage in dialogue and debate, not coercion. In 1965, you could hardly find a company more awful than Nucor. It had only one division that made money. Everything else drained cash. It had no culture to be proud of. It had no consistent direction. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. At the time, Nucor was officially known as the Nuclear Corporation of America, reflecting its orientation to nuclear energy products, including the scintillation probe. Yes, they really named it that, used for radiation measurement. It had acquired a series of unrelated businesses in such areas as semiconductor supplies, rare earth materials, electrostatic office copiers, and roof joists. At the start of its transformation in 1965, Nucor did not manufacture 1 ounce of steel. Nor did it make a penny of profit. Yet 30 years later, from this disastrous beginning of transformation, Nucor stood as the 4th largest steelmaker in the world, and by 1999 made greater annual profits than any other American steel company. How did Nucor transition from the utterly awful Nuclear Corporation of America into perhaps the best steel company in America? First, Nucor benefited from the emergence of a level 5 leader, Ken Iverson, promoted to CEO from general manager of the joist division. Second, Iverson got the right people on the bus, building a remarkable team of people like Sam Siegel, described by one of his colleagues as the best money manager in the world, a magician, and David Aycock, an operations genius. And then what? Like Alan Wurtzel, Ken Iverson dreamed of building a great company, but he refused to begin with the answer for how to get there. Instead, he played the role of Socratic moderator in a series of raging debates. We established an ongoing series of general manager meetings, and my role was more as a mediator, commented Iverson. They were chaos. We would stay there for hours, ironing out the issues until we came to something. At times, the meetings would get so violent that people almost went across the table at each other. People yelled. They waved their arms around and pounded on tables. Faces would get red, and veins bulged out. Iverson's assistant tells of a scene repeated over the years wherein colleagues would march into Iverson's office and yell and scream at each other, but then emerge with a conclusion. Argue and debate, then sell the nuclear business. Argue and debate, then focus on steel joists. Argue and debate, then begin to manufacture their own steel. Argue and debate, then invest in their own mini-mill. Argue and debate, then build a second mini-mill, and so forth and so on. Nearly all the Nucor executives we spoke with described a climate of debate, wherein the company's strategy evolved through many agonizing arguments and fights. Like Nucor, all the good to great companies had a penchant for intense dialogue. Phrases like loud debate, heated discussions, and healthy conflict peppered the articles and interview transcripts from all the companies. They didn't use discussion as a sham process to let people have their say so that they could buy in to a predetermined decision. This is simply manipulation. The process was more like a heated scientific debate, with people engaged in a search for the best answers. Point 3. Conduct autopsies without blame. In 1978, Philip Morris acquired the 7-Up Company, only to sell it 8 years later at a loss. The financial loss was relatively small compared to Philip Morris's total assets, but it was a highly visible black eye that consumed thousands of hours of precious management time. In our interviews with the Philip Morris executives, we were struck by how they all brought up the debacle on their own and discussed it openly. Instead of hiding their big, ugly mistake, they seemed to feel an almost therapeutic need to talk about it. In his book, I'm a Lucky Guy, Joe Cullman dedicates 5 pages to dissecting the 7-Up disaster. He doesn't hold back the embarrassing truth about how flawed the decision was. It is a 5-page clinical analysis of the mistake, its implications, and its lessons. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people hours had been spent in autopsies of the 7-Up case. Yet, as much as they talked about this conspicuous failure, no one pointed fingers to single out blame. There is only one exception to this pattern, and that's Joe Cullman himself, standing in front of the mirror, pointing the finger right at himself. It became apparent that this was another Joe Cullman plan that didn't work, Joe Cullman writes. He goes even further, implying that if he'd only listened better to the people who challenged his idea at the time, the disaster might have been averted. He goes out of his way to give credit to those who were right in retrospect, naming those specific individuals who were more prescient than himself. In a modern era, when leaders go to great lengths to preserve the image of their own track record, stepping forth to claim credit about how they were visionary when their colleagues were not, but finding other people to blame when their decisions go awry, it's quite refreshing, I find it refreshing, to come across Joe Cullman. He set the tone. I will take responsibility for this bad decision, but we will all take responsibility for extracting the maximum learning from the tuition that we've paid. When you conduct autopsies without blame, conducting autopsies to figure out what went wrong without any need to put the blame on someone else. You go a long way toward creating a climate where the truth is heard. If you have the right people on the bus, you should almost never need to assign blame, but need only to search for understanding and learning. If you have the right people on the bus, chances are there's a system problem, not a people problem. Point 4. Build red flag mechanisms. We live in an information age when those with more and better information supposedly have an advantage. If you look across the rise and fall of organizations, however, you will rarely find companies stumbling because they lacked information. Bethlehem Steel executives had known for years about the threat of mini-mill companies like Nucor. They paid little attention until they woke up one day to discover large chunks of market share taken away. Upjohn, the comparison company to Abbott, had plenty of information that indicated some of its forthcoming products would fail to deliver anticipated results, or worse, had potentially serious side effects. Yet, it often ignored those problems. With Halcyon, for example, an insider was quoted in Newsweek as saying, dismissing safety concerns about Halcyon had become virtual company policy. In another case, when Upjohn found itself under fire, it framed its problems as adverse publicity, rather than confronting the truth of its own shortcomings. Executives at Bank of America had plenty of information about the realities of deregulation. Yet, despite having all the information they could possibly need, they failed to confront the one big implication of those realities. In a deregulated world, banking would be a commodity, and the old perks and genteel traditions of banking would be gone forever. Not until it had lost $1.8 billion did Bank of America fully accept this brutal fact. In contrast, Carl Reichert of Wells Fargo, called the ultimate realist by his predecessor, hit the brutal facts of deregulation smack head on. Sorry, fellow bankers, but we can preserve the banker class no more. We've got to be businessmen with as much attention to costs and effectiveness as McDonald's. Indeed, we found no evidence that the good to great companies had more or better information than the comparison companies. None. Both sets of companies had virtually identical access to good information. So if that's the case, how do we explain all of this hoopla around information age and information management? The key, it turns out, lies not in better information, but in turning information into information that cannot be ignored. Catch that phrase again. The key lies not in having better information, but in turning information into information that cannot be ignored. One particularly powerful way to accomplish this is through what I like to call red flag mechanisms, or some people have heard me describe it as catalytic mechanisms. Allow me to use a personal example to illustrate the idea. When I was teaching by the CASE method at Stanford Business School, I issued to each MBA student an 8.5 by 11 bright red sheet of paper with the following instructions. This is your red flag for the quarter. If you raise your hand with your red flag, the world will stop for you. Nothing can prevent you from saying what you have to say. There are no restrictions on when and how to use your red flag. The decision rests entirely in your hands. You can use it to voice an observation, share a personal experience, present an analysis, disagree with the professor, disagree with me, disagree with all your classmates, challenge a CEO guest, respond to a fellow student, ask a question, make a suggestion, whatever. You can do whatever you want with your red flag. There will be no penalty whatsoever for the use of a red flag. Your red flag can be used only once during the quarter, so use it well. But when you use it, no power on earth can take it away from you. Your red flag is non-transferable. You cannot give it or sell to another student. I was a bit nervous using the red flag at first because I had no idea what would happen, especially each day in class. What would somebody do with their red flag? I would lose control over the class discussion for a moment. In one situation, a student flagged me with a red flag and said, "Professor Collins, I think you're doing a particularly ineffective job of running class today. You're leading too much with your questions and stifling our independent thinking. Why don't you let us think for ourselves?" Isn't that wonderful? She was absolutely right. I was doing an ineffective job of Socratic teaching that day, and their learning suffered. Had I not had the red flag and a mechanism for her throwing it in my face, we could have wasted another 40 minutes of 60 people's precious learning time. The red flag confronted me with the brutal fact that my own questioning style stood in the way of people's learning. A student survey at the end of the quarter would have given me that same information, perhaps. But the red flag, in real time, in front of everyone in the classroom, for everybody to see, so I could not possibly ignore it without looking like a complete idiot, turned information about the shortcomings of my class into information that I absolutely could not ignore. I got the idea for the red flag mechanism from Bruce Wolpert, who instituted a particularly powerful device called ShortPay at his company, Granite Rock. ShortPay gives the customer full discretionary power to decide whether and how much to pay on an invoice based upon his or her own subjective evaluation of how he or she feels with the product or service. ShortPay is not a refund policy. The customer does not need to return the product, nor does the customer need to call Granite Rock for permission. The customer simply circles the offending item on the invoice, deducts it from the total, and sends us a check for the balance. Imagine if the airlines did this, right? Imagine if you paid for your trip after your trip, and you circled something, "Well, I wasn't really too happy with the gate agent, so I'm going to take off 40% of the ticket." This would be a catalytic mechanism for the airlines. When I asked Wolpert for his reasons for ShortPay, he said, "You get a lot of information from customer surveys, but there are always ways of explaining away the data. With ShortPay, you absolutely have to pay attention to the data. You often don't know that a customer is upset until you lose that customer entirely. ShortPay is like an early warning system that forces us to adjust quickly, long before we would lose that customer. ShortPay, in other words, takes information and turns it into information that Granite Rock cannot ignore." To be clear, we did not generally find red flag mechanisms as vivid and dramatic as ShortPay in the Good to Great companies. Nonetheless, I've decided to include the idea here at the urging of research assistant Lane Horning. Horning, who worked on the Good to Great research team and helped me systematically research and collate mechanisms across companies for a different research project, makes a compelling argument that if you're a fully developed level 5 leader, you might not need red flag mechanisms. But if you are not yet a level 5 leader, or if you suffer the liability of charisma, red flag mechanisms give you a practical and useful tool for turning information into information that cannot be ignored, and for creating a climate where the truth is heard.